For more than a decade, Courteney Cox and Johnny McDaid seemed to be one of those rare Hollywood couples who had quietly figured things out. They were never the loudest pair on red carpets, never the kind to fill social media with constant declarations of love, and rarely found themselves at the center of celebrity gossip. Somehow, despite living on different continents, surviving a broken engagement, and spending months apart during difficult times, they always seemed to find their way back to each other. That is why the recent news caught so many people by surprise. After more than 10 years together, multiple outlets confirmed that Courteney Cox and Johnny McDaid had ended their relationship. The reports described the separation as friendly rather than dramatic, with people close to them saying there was still respect and affection between the two. There were no public arguments, no emotional statements, and no accusations exchanged online. Just a quiet ending to one of Hollywood's longest-running relationships. For many fans, that silence felt almost harder to understand than a public scandal. When a relationship lasts only a few months, people usually move on quickly. But when two people spend more than a decade building a life around each other, even if they never officially married, the ending carries a different kind of weight. It leaves behind memories, routines, shared dreams, and questions that may never receive public answers. The last time Courteney and Johnny were photographed together was during the 2025 U.S. Open. Nothing about those images suggested they were approaching the final chapter of their relationship. They appeared relaxed, comfortable, and exactly as fans had seen them for years. Looking back now, those photographs have taken on a completely different meaning. What makes this story even more emotional is that Courteney has never been someone who chased attention through her private life. Throughout the years, she often chose privacy over publicity, allowing her work to speak louder than her relationships. Even after becoming one of television's most recognizable faces through Friends, she rarely invited cameras into the most personal parts of her life. That is one reason this breakup has resonated with so many longtime fans. Many people grew up watching Courteney. They watched her as Monica Geller during one of television's most successful sitcoms, saw her return in the Scream franchise, and followed her career through different stages of her life. To them, she is more than another celebrity whose relationship has ended. She represents someone who has spent decades in the public eye while trying to protect the parts of life that mattered most. And perhaps that is what makes this moment feel different. This was not the collapse of a whirlwind romance. It was the quiet conclusion of a relationship that had already survived obstacles many couples never overcome. They had experienced heartbreak before. They had chosen to rebuild. They had learned how to live thousands of miles apart. For years, those challenges seemed to make them stronger rather than weaker. So what changed? To understand why this ending feels so much heavier than an ordinary celebrity breakup, we have to go back to the very beginning, long before the headlines, before the engagement, and before anyone imagined that a simple introduction at a party would completely change Courteney Cox's life. If someone had told Courteney Cox in 2013 that a casual evening at her own home would lead to one of the most important relationships of her life, she probably would not have believed it. At that point, she had already lived through experiences that had changed her forever. She had become one of the most recognizable actresses in television history through Friends, built a successful film career, gone through a public marriage and divorce with David Arquette, and devoted herself to raising her daughter, Coco. Love was still part of her life, but it no longer seemed like something she was desperately searching for. Then one evening, everything changed. The introduction came through someone millions of people already knew. Ed Sheeran had become friends with Courteney and was invited to a gathering at her house. Along with him came Johnny McDaid, the Northern Irish musician from Snow Patrol. It was the first time Courteney had ever met him, and she admitted years later that she noticed him almost immediately. Speaking about that evening during an interview on The Howard Stern Show, Courteney remembered seeing Johnny sitting at the piano. She said he immediately stood out from everyone else in the room. It was not because he was trying to attract attention, quite the opposite. There was something calm about him that caught her eye. She recalled thinking that he looked incredibly handsome. describing him as someone with intense eyes and a quiet confidence that made a lasting impression. Even so, she did nothing about it. They spoke briefly during the evening, but neither of them exchanged phone numbers before the party ended. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. But sometimes life moves in unexpected ways. Not long after the party, Courtney mentioned to her friend Isla Fisher that she thought Johnny was attractive. Isla shared the conversation with her husband, Sacha Baron Cohen, who jokingly passed the message along to Johnny. According to Courtney, Johnny reached out the very next day, and before long, they had their first date. What happened after that surprised almost everyone around them. Unlike many celebrity romances that slowly develop over months, their connection seemed immediate. Friends noticed how comfortable they were together from the beginning. Despite living in different countries and having careers that constantly pulled them in opposite directions, they appeared to find a balance that worked. Courtney had spent years under the spotlight, often surrounded by people who saw the actress before they saw the person. Johnny came from a different world. While he was respected throughout the music industry as a songwriter and producer, he had never lived with the same level of Hollywood attention. Perhaps that difference became one of their greatest strengths. She later described him as patient, intelligent, deeply thoughtful, and someone who challenged her to grow emotionally rather than simply making her feel comfortable. Those qualities seemed to matter far more to her than red carpets or public appearances. Within months, the relationship had become serious enough that people close to them realized this was no ordinary Hollywood romance. Neither of them knew it yet, but the years ahead would bring enormous happiness, painful disappointment, difficult choices, and moments that would test their relationship in ways neither could have imagined. And surprisingly, one of the biggest decisions of their lives would arrive much sooner than anyone expected. By the beginning of 2014, it was already becoming clear that Courteney Cox and Johnny McDaid were moving much faster than anyone had expected. Only a few months had passed since their first date, yet the connection between them seemed remarkably strong. Friends noticed it. Family noticed it. Even people who had followed Courtney's life for years began to believe that she had finally found the quiet happiness she had been looking for after so many years in the spotlight. Then came the news that surprised almost everyone. Less than a year after meeting, Johnny proposed. The engagement became public in 2014, and for a while, everything appeared to be falling perfectly into place. Courtney happily shared the news with her fans, posting a simple message that said, "I'm engaged to him." It was joyful, uncomplicated, and reflected how excited she seemed about the future. For many people, this felt like the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Courtney had already experienced marriage once before. Her relationship with actor David Arquette had brought both wonderful memories and painful lessons. Although their marriage ended, they remained committed to raising their daughter, Coco, together. Over time, they built a friendship that many divorced couples struggle to achieve. Johnny entered her life during a period when she seemed far more interested in emotional stability than public attention. Unlike Hollywood actors, he lived a much quieter life. As a songwriter and member of Snow Patrol, he spent far more time creating music than attending celebrity events. That difference appeared to bring balance into Courtney's world. She often spoke about him with genuine admiration. In one interview, she described him as intelligent, patient, and incredibly kind. She also said he challenged her in ways that helped her become a better person. Those were not the kinds of compliments usually heard during celebrity interviews promoting a glamorous relationship. They sounded personal, thoughtful, and sincere. Johnny seemed equally devoted. While discussing wedding plans during one appearance, he admitted that the ceremony itself was never the most important part. What mattered to him was simply spending the rest of his life with Courtney. It was a simple statement, but one that left a lasting impression because it reflected how differently the two approached fame. Their families also appeared to embrace the relationship. Courtney's daughter, Coco, became excited about the possibility of the wedding. During television interviews, Courtney laughed while explaining that Coco wanted to help organize everything herself. She joked that her daughter planned to be the maid of honor, the flower girl, and practically every bridesmaid at once. It was one of those rare moments where fans could picture not a Hollywood couple, but a normal family looking forward to a celebration. Looking back today, those interviews feel almost bittersweet. The excitement was real. The plans were real. The hope was real. No one involved knew that only a short time later, everything would suddenly change, because behind the smiling photographs, the romantic vacations, and the public appearances, challenges were already beginning to emerge. They were not dramatic enough to become tabloid headlines, but they were serious enough to quietly place enormous pressure on the relationship. And before either of them had the chance to walk down the aisle, the engagement that once seemed so certain would come to an unexpected end. What happened next would become one of the most painful experiences Courteney Cox has ever spoken about publicly. And years later, she would admit that it changed the way she understood love forever. For many couples, the end of an engagement is the end of the relationship. For Courteney Cox and Johnny McDaid, it became something much more complicated. Not long after announcing their engagement, cracks began to appear behind the scenes. From the outside, everything still looked promising. They attended events together, continued supporting each other's careers, and rarely gave the public any reason to believe something was wrong. Then, toward the end of 2015, the engagement quietly came to an end. There was no dramatic press conference, no public accusations, no tabloid war. They simply went their separate ways. For months, fans wondered what had happened. Neither Courteney nor Johnny rushed to explain the breakup. Instead, they chose privacy over publicity, something that had become a defining characteristic of their relationship. Years later, however, Courteney shared a deeply personal story that completely changed how many people viewed that difficult period. Speaking on the Many Questions podcast in 2024, she revealed that Johnny had ended their relationship during what was supposed to be a couples therapy session. She recalled that the breakup happened almost immediately after the session began. It was not what she expected. It was not something she had prepared herself to hear. Looking back, she admitted that she felt shocked and deeply hurt. Yet she also said that over time, she came to see that painful moment as one of the experiences that forced her to grow emotionally. Instead of describing Johnny with anger, she spoke about learning more about herself, about her boundaries, her fears, and the kind of relationship she truly wanted. That response says a great deal about who Courteney had become. Many people would have turned such a private moment into a public controversy. She did the opposite. She rarely discussed the breakup, and when she finally did, it was not to blame Johnny or rewrite history. It was to explain how painful experiences can sometimes reveal parts of ourselves we never knew existed. She even admitted that therapy eventually became something valuable, not because it saved the relationship at that moment, but because it helped her better understand herself. That perspective surprised many fans. Instead of portraying Johnny as the villain, she continued describing him as someone she respected deeply. Even after everything they had gone through, she still spoke warmly about his intelligence, kindness, and patience. It would have been easy for the story to end there. The engagement was over. The wedding would never happen. Most people assumed they would quietly move on with separate lives. But then something unexpected happened. After spending several months apart, Courteney and Johnny slowly found their way back to each other. There was no elaborate announcement, no glamorous magazine cover celebrating their reunion. The relationship simply resumed, almost as quietly as it had ended. Friends close to the couple later described the renewed relationship as healthier and more mature. The experience of losing each other had changed both of them. They seemed less focused on labels and wedding plans and more interested in building something that could survive real life. For years afterward, that decision appeared to be the right one. They stayed together. They supported one another. They continued navigating careers on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Many fans assumed the hardest days were finally behind them. Looking back now, it is impossible not to wonder whether that painful chapter had truly been closed, or whether it had simply become one more obstacle that the relationship managed to survive for a little while longer. Because despite rebuilding their love after the engagement ended, one challenge never disappeared. They were still trying to make a relationship work while living thousands of miles apart, and over time, that distance would become impossible to ignore. When Courteney Cox and Johnny McDaid decided to give their relationship another chance in 2016, they did so with a very different perspective. The excitement of wedding plans was gone. The pressure of becoming husband and wife had disappeared. Instead, they focused on something much simpler and perhaps much more difficult: making everyday life work. For a while, it seemed they had found the perfect balance. They no longer spoke much about getting married. Courteney later admitted that marriage itself was not what mattered most to her anymore. What mattered was the relationship. She once explained that she was committed to Johnny whether they signed legal papers or not. After everything they had already survived together, labels simply felt less important. But one challenge never truly disappeared: distance. Courteney's career and family life were centered in California. Johnny's work kept him closely connected to London, Northern Ireland, and the music industry throughout Europe. Unlike many celebrity couples who eventually settle in one place, they spent years building a relationship that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean. Flights became routine. Goodbyes became routine. Reunions became routine. They learned to live with calendars instead of schedules, airports instead of ordinary commutes, and FaceTime instead of dinner together. Then came the pandemic. Like millions of couples around the world, they suddenly found themselves separated for far longer than expected. Travel restrictions kept them apart for months. During interviews at the time, Courteney openly admitted how difficult that period had become. She joked about counting the days since she had last seen Johnny, but behind the humor was something very real. She missed ordinary things. Not glamorous vacations, not red carpets. She simply missed sitting next to him, hugging him, and sharing everyday life again. She even said she missed his physical touch more than anything else. When travel restrictions finally eased, they reunited. To many fans, that reunion felt like proof that they could survive almost anything. If months apart during a global pandemic could not break them, what possibly could? For several more years, the answer appeared to be nothing. They continued appearing together occasionally, supported each other's careers, and rarely gave the public any indication that another breakup was on the horizon. In fact, the last photographs of them together, taken at the U.S. Open in September 2025, showed two people who looked comfortable and relaxed in each other's company. Nothing about those images suggested they were only months away from quietly ending one of Hollywood's longest relationships. According to reports published after the separation became public, the breakup itself was not driven by a dramatic betrayal or a public scandal. Instead, people familiar with the couple described two individuals who had gradually begun living different lives. Even after more than a decade together, the practical reality of maintaining separate homes, separate careers, and separate continents eventually became difficult to ignore. Friends quoted in recent reports emphasized that the split remained respectful and that Johnny continued speaking warmly about Courteney. They reportedly remained close friends, despite accepting that their romantic relationship had reached its natural conclusion. Perhaps that is what makes their story so unusual. There was no explosive ending, no public blame, no final interview explaining everything. Just two people who had spent years proving that love could survive almost any obstacle. Until one day, they quietly accepted that sometimes love alone cannot overcome the realities of everyday life. For Courteney, however, the end of the relationship was not the end of her story. If anything, it marked the beginning of another chapter, one that would force her to rediscover who she was without the man who had stood beside her for more than a decade. For more than a decade, Johnny McDaid was part of Courteney Cox's everyday world. Not always physically, because distance was a constant part of their relationship, but emotionally. Whether they were celebrating birthdays, attending award shows, supporting each other's careers, or simply finding time together between flights, there was always the quiet expectation that somehow they would continue finding their way back to one another. Now, for the first time in many years, that chapter has come to an end. According to multiple reports, the breakup was not fueled by anger or betrayal. Friends close to the couple described it as a respectful decision made after they gradually began living different lives. They reportedly remain on good terms, and neither Courtney nor Johnny has publicly criticized the other. In many ways, that quiet respect seems consistent with the relationship they shared for more than 10 years. For someone like Courtney, however, even an amicable ending carries enormous emotional weight. She is no stranger to rebuilding her life. She has rebuilt after the end of her marriage to David Arquette. She has rebuilt after career disappointments. She has rebuilt after personal struggles that she has openly discussed over the years. And she has rebuilt before after losing Johnny once. Perhaps that is why so many longtime fans believe she will eventually rebuild again. But rebuilding never means pretending that nothing happened. One of the reasons Courtney has remained so respected throughout her career is that she has rarely tried to create a perfect image of herself. She has spoken honestly about getting older, about insecurities, about cosmetic procedures she later regretted, and about learning to accept herself as time passed. That honesty has allowed many fans to grow older alongside her rather than simply watching her from a distance. Today, at 62, she represents something very different from the young actress millions first met as Monica Geller. She represents resilience, not because life has been easy, but because every difficult chapter has been followed by another beginning. Even now, there is no indication that Courtney intends to step away from acting or disappear from public life. She continues working, remains close to longtime friends, and enjoys a strong relationship with her daughter, Coco. Those parts of her life did not disappear with the end of her relationship, and they will likely continue shaping whatever comes next. Still, it is impossible to ignore what this relationship meant. More than 10 years together. A proposal, a broken engagement, a painful separation, a reunion that many people believed would last forever, and finally, a quiet goodbye. Perhaps that is why this story has touched so many people around the world. It reminds us that some of life's biggest endings do not arrive with dramatic headlines. Sometimes they arrive with silence. Sometimes two people can love each other deeply, respect each other completely, and still reach different destinations. That does not erase the years they shared. It does not erase the memories they created. And it certainly does not erase the impact they had on one another's lives. For Courteney Cox, this may be one of the most emotional chapters she has faced in recent years. But if her life has taught us anything, it is that she has never allowed one difficult season to define her entire story. The next chapter has not been written yet, and perhaps that is exactly why so many people are still watching. If you followed Courteney Cox's journey over the years, from her unforgettable days on Friends to the quieter moments that shaped her life away from the cameras, we'd love to hear from you. Do you think some relationships are meant to last forever, or can two people truly care for each other and still know when it's time to let go? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about the lives of the celebrities who shaped generations, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more remarkable journeys still waiting to be told.